Hello, I'm Paul Normann. I'm the Executive Director of Neighborhood Place of Puna. Neighborhood Place of Puna is a nonprofit that works to support families in making sure that they have the resources, skills, and supports they need to be successful in raising their children. Very fortunate today to have with me Reverend Eric Anderson, who is the pastor at Holy Cross United Church of Christ. He is also the president of the Interfaith Communities in Action. And we're going to be here to talk a little bit about the holiday season. So welcome.
Thank you, Paul. It's great to be with you and great to be with all the folks who are watching.
All right, so I'm going to just jump right in. We had a nice little warm-up conversation, and so I just wanted to start by the thing that we've talked about in the past, and educate our community a little bit that when we look at the data, what we see here on our island, on the Big Island, Hawaii Island, that of all the individuals who experienced homelessness in the past year, 1/3 of those individuals were children. And of those children, half of them were under the age of 5. And that's important because that's a very developmentally crucial age. And that's when your brain's being formed. There's no do-over. Your brain's formed, that's it. And for me, as an individual, that is that's a very sobering thought, that many of our children are experiencing homelessness. And so here we are in the Christmas season. We're celebrating the birth of Jesus, birth of the Christ. And I just really want to ask you, is celebrating Christmas, is celebrating the birth enough?
And the simple answer is no. Celebration in any religious context is always important. But in the Christian tradition, the understanding has always been that worship is the first step, and service and the ordering of a just and compassionate society are the next steps. So you just can't stop. The whole point, I shouldn't say the whole point, one of the points of a Sunday worship is to empower the souls for Monday work. And one of the ways of empowering souls for Monday work is to understand that work as being an expression of compassion and the creation of a community in which people support one another. It would be wonderful if that could stop with individual charity, but it never has. The ancient law of Israel, for example, required that landowners not harvest the grain at the borders of fields. The reason was because that had to be left for people to glean in order to make their way down the roads and have access to what was, I suspect, really nasty food. Raw wheat, yuck. But who took advantage of that in his lifetime? Jesus, or at least his associates did. So there's got to be not just an assumption that you and I are going to provide some sort of a meal or temporary shelter to a neighbor. You and I are going to create a society, along with all the other folks around us, in which those neighbors are not looking for a roof or for a meal.
Okay, well, so I agree. Yes, wonderful. And so, Yes, I mean, this is, yes, I'm totally agree with you that this is what we're trying to do, that we're trying to create a society, a community where there is less physical suffering, especially by the vulnerable, by the ones who are um, have the least resources, least ability to help themselves. Um, and so what do you? So here we are in the middle of COVID. Lots of suffering. We're on the cusp of looks like an eviction crisis. So do you have any advice or suggestions for how we can take the next step? We can celebrate the birth of the Christ child and, move forward in building this society, this wonderful society that does not allow for children to experience homelessness.
Uh, there's kind of an obvious first step, because the question at this point usually comes up, well, how are you going to pay for all this? Because the things to pay for are pretty darned obvious. You need to pay for things to get built, and you need to pay for land to put the things to be built on, and utilities and all that sort of stuff. You need to pay people to do work at a wage that is consistent with the upkeep of the homes and the feeding of the families. Uh, it appalls me that we consistently pay people less than a living wage and think we're doing justice. So the first obvious step is tax the wealthy.
Mm.
And people will ask, well, why the wealthy? And the answer is because they've got the money at this point. We're long past the point where folks who are either poor or in quote unquote middle income can actually sustain the kind of society that we want to have.
Mm.
And the accretion of wealth over the last, I think it's about 40 years at this point, has been quite stunning in the United States in particular, and globally. So, yeah, it's time to reverse the policies that have allowed that wealth to consolidate to such an extent. And it's time to insist that that folks who are really doing the hardest work are being appropriately compensated for their labors. And it's also time to see that the most vulnerable, and children definitely fall into the category of most vulnerable, they are not able to contribute in the same way towards their life's needs as at least most working adults. It is. Oh, I've forgotten her name now. She's head of Children's Defense Fund, I think. Marian Wright Edelman. Marian Wright Edelman quote I just cannot get out of my head, that the measure of society is how it treats its children. And by that measure, with a third of our homeless neighbors here on this island being children, we are failing that test. So.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very, very powerful message. And yeah, I've been hearing the kind of framing I've been hearing on this need for looking at our way the wealth is kind of being being kind of, I don't know what the word is, but disproportionately, it's getting too few too few people have too much. But that creating the structures for the opportunity for shared prosperity. And then somehow we've lost that since I think like the 70s. Okay. I think, wow. That is powerful. I mean, what you're sharing, very powerful, obviously touches my heart, touches the work that we do. Do you have any last thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, we talked earlier about the relevance of this season. The Christmas season amongst Christians has been one associated with giving for quite some time. We've managed to transform it in some kind of startling ways. For example, the original gifts of St. Nicholas, at least in the stories, right? They were gifts to provide the family with a very poor family with daughters. They were designed to provide a dowry so that they could get married instead of being sold into, well, prostitution. We'd call it human trafficking in these days.
Yeah, yeah.
Funny how we don't mention that when, the fellow with the white beard and the red suit comes around. We also don't like to remember the end of the Magi story. The Magi came by with gifts. The gifts all had to be used to support Mary, Joseph, and Jesus as they fled from Bethlehem, because the local monarch had decided to literally eliminate the life of a potential rival. We call it the slaughter of the innocents when we think of it at all. So the wealth that had been shared with them evaporated, and that's why Jesus grew up poor. So individual charity was effective for one family, but it did not help the other families of Bethlehem who suffered. Then the family returned after the death of King Herod. So it took political change for them to go back home, but even then they didn't go home. In Matthew's account, that's when the family shifted their residence from Bethlehem to Nazareth, because they didn't trust Herod's successor to not seek after them, and particularly after Jesus, as a potential rival. So incremental political change, incremental governmental change has its benefits, but the increments have to be pursued. The increments have to continue in order for families to live in safety, in economic security, and in a place where they are then able to be good neighbors to their neighbors.
That's a wonderful ending, and yet I'm filled with questions, which I really want to ask. So, I'm just going to ask it, and we can edit it out or not.
Sure.
So, in this telling, in that telling or more full telling of the story around the Holy Family fleeing,
right?
If when we reimagine it, because basically the liturgical year is about retelling the story, and we are kind of in the story as participants. So in this story, if we retell it now, are we Herod, or are we? I mean, really? I mean, are we kind of Herod? Are we by Herod? I don't mean the individual Herod, but the kind of system of government that is doing the putting all this pressure, causing all this, killing all these
Right.
innocents and forcing Jesus and the Holy Family and probably others to flee, to flee and be displaced. Are we that, or is that our role in this story really, or are we really kind of sitting there alongside the Holy Family in their flight to save their lives?
Oh, that is a good question. I think there are other roles in the story, most of which don't end up, well, in the original story. Because another option, of course, is, are we the Magi? Are we providing that sort of baseline gift that allows a family to preserve its life? Um, it's very easy to look at governmental policy in recent years and to say there's some definite heralding going on. We've got lots of homeless children here on this island. There's also hundreds of parentless children separated from their families by governmental policy, and the failure to reunite them, well, that's a combination of Herod and some set of incompetent ministers, right?
Mm.
There's also the soldiers who followed Herod's orders. There's plenty of folks to adopt those roles. There's the neighbors in Bethlehem who watched the soldiers come down the street and said, I can't do anything. One hopes that there were neighbors who did stand and say, I'm going to do something, but we don't hear about them. What seems likely is that there weren't enough of them to actually prevent the atrocity from happening. So where are we? Are we, if we are literally in the role of Herod, well, there's a Christian notion about that sort of thing. It's called repentance, right? If we are in the role of those who are carrying out the policies of the Herods, there's repentance for that as well. It was, in fact, it was typical of Christians in the early years of the faith to require Roman soldiers to leave soldiering. And it's one of the reasons why the Romans were not particularly enthusiastic about the growth of Christianity. Are we amongst those who are standing by and watching the horrors and not doing anything about it? Chances are fairly good most of us are. That's a fairly popular role historically. Are we amongst those who are trying to stand up to the injustice? Are we amongst those who are at least preserving someone from the injustice? And for some in this country, they are in the place of those who are either fleeing or those who are being victimized. Yeah. To place myself, if I'm honest, all too often I suspect that I am amongst that silent bystander, because to a certain extent, these injustices do serve preserving my role in society. And standing up to the soldiers looks dangerous. The best I usually do is either to make some kind of public protest or to try and make sure that some of those basic needs get filled.
Yeah. yeah, I mean, it does, to stand up is to challenge the status quo. And I imagine the reason we don't hear about anybody challenging the, the Roman soldiers coming in, or whoever it was that was Herod, had the power to order to come carry out these atrocities, is because they died in those atrocities.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And, here, of course, challenging status quo might not mean dying, but it might mean losing position and power or wealth or security. I mean, nobody wants, as we see just from COVID, we get really uncomfortable when things change and get insecure.
That's right. That's
right. Wow. Yeah. So, oh, okay. So I'm thinking we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. You've given me much to think about. I really appreciate it. I want to encourage anybody who's watching this, everybody who's watching this, to please visit neighborhoodplace.org. If you are moved by this, please donate to support the families we help, or support your local nonprofit or another cause that you feel passionate about. We're all working to get the work done. We're all working to help families and make sure that our children grow up in a healthy, nurturing, safe home. So aloha, and I guess I should say Merry Christmas. Thank you very much, Pastor Eric.
Thank you very much. It's always a delight to talk with you, and may all your days in this season be bright.
Aloha.